Start with between. All right, when we're talking about between, what we're looking at is a point between two endpoints, or if it is between, what does it give us? Okay, so what we need to think about here is if I've got 2 points, okay, with a point between. So let's say we got A, we got B, we've got this point C that's between A and B. Okay, so in the homework, on the problems that you're going to be working, it'll say, this point is between these 2 points. This point is between these other 2 points. Okay, so what that tells us then is if C is between A and B, what it gives us actually an equation that we can use comparing these lengths of these segments. So if C is between A and B, then what that tells me is that AC, the segment, okay, plus CB, the segment, has to equal the entire line AB. Okay, so this part here and this part here has to equal this whole big thing here. Okay, that's what that says. All right, now that'll be used, if we look at an example here, we can use this to solve problems. So let's say that we've got this P, Q, and R. Okay, so the point Q is between P and R. All right, and maybe the length here is 3x. This length here is x, and the length of PR, this whole length here is, say, 16. Okay, so that's the information you're given. I can use the fact that that point Q is between to help me to write an equation that I can then use to solve for x. And I can use to solve for x. Okay, so if we think about our equation we just got here, I can write an equation here. This would be 3x plus x equals 16. Right? This part plus this part equals this part. Then we just solve the equation, combine our like terms. We get 4x equals 16. Divide both sides by 4. And we get that x equals 4. Okay? So that's how we're going to use the betweenness to help us to solve problems. Okay? Congruent segments. Congruent segments, then, are segments, and you should have defined all these terms already. But congruent segments are segments that have the same size and shape. The key here is that we want to talk about markings. Okay? From now on, as we look at different figures, you're going to have markings on, what we call congruent marks. Okay? And if I think of this, if I have to draw a shape here, we'll call this a rectangle. And you'll learn later on when we start talking about rectangles that rectangles have opposite sides that are congruent with each other. We show that with markings. We use little hash marks, what we call them hash marks. Okay? The number of hash marks on a segment tells you which ones are congruent. Okay? So if I had a rectangle here, I would mark those like that. I would mark these like that. What that would tell me is that these segments here, which I'll mark in, let's say red, okay, these segments here are congruent to each other because they have the same markings on them. They have the same hash mark markings on them. Okay? I also know that these segments, which are marked in green here, are congruent to each other because they have the matching markings on them. They have 2 marks here, 2 marks here. That tells me that they're also congruent, but what it also tells me is that it's different from these. Okay? These are not the same because they have different markings. This has 1 mark, this has 2 marks, therefore those are different. Okay? The opposite sides are the same, they have the same markings, but the adjacent sides are not the same, they have different markings on them, so they are not the same. Okay? We can use this then to solve problems if we need to. Okay? So maybe we get a picture, has a rectangle here, and it tells me that I get 3x plus 5 here, and maybe this is a excuse me. We'll say that's 20. We get some markings on here. It says those two sides are the same. Okay? If they're congruent, which you should have written down and talked about with your definitions, if they're congruent, then they have to be the same. If they're the same, then they're equal. So we can use the idea of congruent segments to help us to write equations, just like we did with the between problem. Okay? So if those two sides are congruent, then they have to be equal to each other, which means that 3x plus 5 has to equal 20. Okay, once I've got the equation written, then I can just solve like normal. 3x equals 15. Divide both sides by 3. Excuse me. And I get that x equals 5. Okay? So, congruent means that they're the same. If two things are the same, that means that they are equal. Their measures are equal to each other. I can use that concept to write equations, which I can then solve to find missing variables or whatever it is the problem is asking me to find. Okay? That's it for betweenness and congruent segments. Good luck. Get your homework done.